I'm Augustus Richard Norton, and you don't know anything about me if you work on Asia. I work on the Middle East. In fact, some of the countries I work on would sort of make up a sub-district in China, I suspect. So it's a fascinating sort of comparative experience for me this morning to chair this panel. I'll make a few brief comments after the papers are presented, and I will introduce each of the speakers right now. We'll try and keep the speakers to about 10 minutes. I'll give each a warning. 15 minutes, all right. I'll give everybody a warning in a couple of minutes, and then a kind of final warning when the 15-minute point comes. We'll begin in the order indicated in the program with Elizabeth Perry, who's the Henry Rosevsky Professor of Government at Harvard University and director of the Harvard Yenchong Institute. She was born in Shanghai, actually, and raised in Tokyo, the author of more than 15 books. Her book, Shanghai on Strike, The Politics of Chinese Labor, won the John King Fairbank Prize for the best book on East Asian history from the American Historical Association. And she'll speak today on popular protest in contemporary China, playing by the rules. Professor Perry.
Thank you, and thank you very much, Joe, for organizing this event. Among the many surprises of the post-Mao reform era has been the upsurge in popular protests that has accompanied reform. The Tiananmen uprising was the largest, the most dramatic of these, but it marked neither the beginning nor the end of widespread unrest in the reform period. In the first decade of reform, China experienced a steady stream of protests, and despite the brutal suppression in Tiananmen Square in the spring of 1989, the frequency of protests escalated in the years after. According to official Chinese statistics, collective protest in China grew tenfold during the period from 1993 to 2005, 8,700 protests supposedly in 93, 87,000 in 2005, and most observers believe the actual figures are substantially higher. China scholars, who had long been accustomed to viewing protest in the PRC under Mao as a product of top-down state mobilization rather than bottom-up social interests, often have heralded this recent post-Mao protest as evidence of a definitive break with the past that indicates a rising rights consciousness propelled by a new appreciation of citizenship. Kevin O'Brien and Lilian Zhang write that, quote, "The notion of being a citizen is seeping into popular discourse. We should not underestimate the implications of rising rights consciousness in a nation where rights have traditionally been weakly protected. Today's rightful resistance could evolve into a much more far-reaching counter-hegemonic project." My co-editor and colleague Merle Goldman there has argued that, quote, "By the century's end, the sense of rights consciousness had spread to the population at large. The transition from comrade to citizen in the People's Republic of China has begun." In a booklet that she wrote recently intended to summarize prevailing scholarship on key issues, Professor Goldman writes, quote, "A growing consciousness of citizenship and organized efforts to assert political rights signify the beginning of a genuine change in the relationship between China's population and the state at the beginning of the 21st century. Now, there is considerable justification for emphasizing the role of rights talk among Chinese protesters. An unmistakable discourse of legal rights permeates the manifestos, petitions, slogans put forth by protesters. Moreover, these protests are often instigated by newly established grassroots citizens' organizations. But the temptation to depict these features as indicating an emergent civil society that may pose a serious threat to the survival of the Chinese Communist state probably should be resisted. The tendency on the part of many analysts to frame the discussion of contemporary protest in terms of Western political concepts like rights consciousness and citizenship, unless these terms are very carefully distinguished from their Western counterparts, creates, I think, expectation of a fundamental change in state-society relations in China that, to me, seems unwarranted. When we place the current protest in historical perspective, the evidence that emerges does not, in my view, offer grounds for an optimistic prognosis that state authoritarianism may be eroding under the pressures of a newly awakened and assertive society. To be sure, the protests that currently roil the Chinese landscape present serious challenges to the leadership. Although most of these protests are directed against grassroots officials, protesters often take their petitions to higher levels, including all the way to Beijing, if a local resolution is not forthcoming. Moreover, the protests can be highly disruptive of government operations when demonstrators surround government offices, march through city streets, stage sit-ins in public places, block traffic on busy highways and railways. But however visible and vocal and sometimes violent these protests may be, they usually go to great lengths to show their loyalty to central policies and central leaders. In this respect, today's protests continue a core feature of both Mao era and pre-Mao era protests, namely a tendency on the part of protesters to advance their claims within the legitimate boundaries authorized by the central state. To be sure, these boundaries have shifted in important ways over time, but whether we're talking about pre- or post-1989 reform period, or for that matter, about Mao era or even pre-Mao era China, protesters have shown a consistent tendency to play by the rules. Although the language of class conflict that was articulated by so-called comrades during Mao's time has been supplanted by a language of legal rights articulated by so-called citizens today, it is not readily apparent, at least to me, that protesters in these two periods differ all that fundamentally in either their mentality or their relationship to the state. Rather than interpret protest in contemporary China as emblematic of a seditious rights consciousness, in which nascent citizens assert their autonomous interests vis-a-vis the state, I see these protests as reflecting a seasoned rules consciousness that serves more to shore up than to subvert authoritarian rule. Now, much of my paper, which I'd be pleased for you to take a look at if you have the time, but which I don't have time to go into here, deals with the Mao period. Thanks to newly available archival sources, we have a much better understanding of protest in the Mao period. And I talk in particular about the massive strike wave that rolled across Chinese cities in 1956, 57, then the so-called wind of economism in 1966, 67, trying to make the point that actually there was considerably more bottom-up spontaneity in protest during that so-called totalitarian period than we sometimes remember, but that this protest followed certain rules and conventions as it does today. From the earliest days of the new communist regime to the final months of Mao's life, widespread popular protest was a continuing reality. These protests typically began with petitions that cited national rules and regulations and that invoked central state authority, often, of course, the incendiary utterances of Mao himself, to justify their claims as legitimate. These were classic cases of what O'Brien and Lee recently have called rightful resistance, but they pointed not toward a new awakening of social citizenship, but rather to a persistent tendency that I believe is traceable back to the imperial era, a tendency of Chinese protesters to work an authoritarian political system to their own advantage. In the 1980s, the agricultural reforms, which Joe and others have already talked about, returned control over farming to individual households. And these were accompanied by a huge upsurge in rural reform. By the late 1980s, as local governments imposed higher taxes and surcharges that followed in the wake of decollectivization, the target of rural unrest shifted to grassroots agencies and grassroots officials. Tax riots blazed across the Chinese countryside in the 1990s in opposition to what farmers, taking their cue from the language of central leaders, referred to as unfair peasant burdens. Villagers were quick to seize upon the language of democracy and law popularized by the post-Mao state to press their grievances against local officials. As a young farmer complained in 1988, "Isn't the state building democratic politics? We farmers also want democracy. It's both reasonable and lawful to pay taxes. We farmers are not confused about this, but they just take money from us in some muddled way," unquote. By the 1990s, tax resistance had reached alarming proportions, with reports of beatings, property destruction, arson, and other violence targeting local cadres, instances of peasants killing cadres and sometimes being hailed as local heroes in the process. These were openly reported in the Chinese press. The public sympathy that these protests elicited derived in large part, I think, from the fact that they generally followed a series of recognized stages in which villagers dutifully acknowledged the authority of the central state. Protests generally began with a collective petition or a letter of complaint that chided local officials for failing to abide by higher-level dictates. Despite the frequency and scale of these protests, they were constrained by protesters' willingness to play by the rules, to cite government's rules and regulations in order to demand that local officials live up to central regulations. While the Chinese countryside has seethed with tax riots and land disputes in the post-Mao period, the cities also have been filled with popular contention. The April 5th demonstration in 1976 demonstrated the willingness of urbanites to express political criticism even before Chairman Mao had passed away. And shortly after Mao's death, the Democracy Wall movement of 1978 to 9 saw an outpouring of posters and street lectures calling for elections and other political reforms. In these cases also, students clamoring for democracy took pains to play by the state's rules. A striking feature even of the so-called democracy movement of 1989, the Tiananmen Uprising, was the deference that students paid to state authority. Student petitioners who attempted unsuccessfully to gain a hearing from the central leadership went so far as to drop to their knees and kowtow up the stairs of the Great Hall of the People in Tiananmen Square, a time-honored ritual of humble subjects showing their respect for government authority. While this may have been an ironic step, it nonetheless was presented by the press, Chinese and foreign at the time, as an indication of the students' respect for state authority. Paralleling the well-publicized democracy movements of the late 70s and 80s, Chinese cities witnessed an upsurge in labor protest as well. Although we usually think of 1989 as a student movement, proletarian participation in that occasion was also substantial. Large numbers of workers took to the streets, marching behind banners emblazoned with the names of their factories. One might have expected urban protest to subside after the brutal suppression of June 4th, yet just the opposite occurred. Worker unrest grew in both frequency and scale, often spilling outside the factory doors into public spaces. In China today, where the government trumpets rule by law, and bookstores and television and radio programs are filled with government pronouncements about legal rights, protesters routinely cite legal regulations to justify their demands. Sociologist Qingquan Li, who has been studying Chinese labor protests for some period of time, describes a protest by laid-off workers who marched behind banners and presented a petition that read in part, "Here are the discrepancies between the bankruptcy law and our situation. First, the procedure of bankruptcy is illegal, according to instructions on bankruptcy of state-owned enterprises passed by the People's Government Office. There must be approval by workers' congresses. Second, workers received no livelihood allowance. This is a violation of clause number 4 in the bankruptcy law, unquote. The invocation of laws is indeed a prominent feature of popular protest in contemporary China. But whether this points to a newfound rights consciousness rather than a much more familiar practice of presenting one's demands in language acceptable to the state so as to receive a sympathetic hearing from the state is debatable. When Qinghuan Li asked workers in Liaoning whether they were fighting for citizens' legal rights, she was greeted with scorn. One worker representative explained to her, because you're talking to the government, you have to talk about laws and regulations, otherwise they can simply ignore you, unquote. Contemporary Chinese protesters, like generations before them, play by the rules of a widely understood, although of course ever-changing game, whose operating procedures are shaped by interaction with and testing of government authorities. Chinese protesters go to great lengths to demonstrate that their actions are intended to strengthen rather than to subvert the authority of the state. They do this through the self-conscious use of the state's own rhetoric, presenting their claims in language authorized by laws, policies, and statements of the government and its leadership. China lays claim to one of the oldest and most robust tradition of protest of any country in the world. Passed down through legends, local operas, and other media, familiar repertoires of popular resistance were for centuries a major means of alerting an authoritarian system to the grievances of ordinary people. Under certain unusual conditions, protests could escalate into the large rebellions for which Chinese history is known. But for the most part, unrest was contained at the grassroots level and did not constitute a political challenge to the central authorities. As an American living in China in 1895 wrote, quote, "The Chinese have in numberless instances risen in opposition to their local rulers, but it has been an uprising against abuses of the system of government, not against the system itself. They have been known to deal with a local magistrate in a most democratic and unceremonious manner, but it was not because of the exercise on his part of lawful authority, but because he had exceeded it," unquote. Imperial-era protests, like protests today, frequently began with the presentation of petitions, usually written in boilerplate language, that referred to the authority and benevolence of the central state in order to condemn the illegal and venal behavior of local officials. So standard and predictable were the manifestations of these protests that the historian Xiao Gongquan refers to them as model riots. Of course, not all Chinese protests were or are perfectly orderly or obedient. Like that of other nations, Chinese history is replete with mob violence and bloodletting. And as is true elsewhere across the globe, such rampages can still be found today. But China differs from many other countries in that its dominant modes of unrest have for centuries taken the form of highly scripted protest repertoires, intended not only to register indignation, but also to signal an interest in negotiating with an authoritarian state that takes such deferential expressions of discontent extremely seriously. My argument is definitely not that China has not changed since imperial days. It has, of course, been transformed politically as well as economically and socially in amazing, almost unimaginable ways over the last 3 decades, let alone the last 3 centuries. My point is simply that widespread popular protest directed against lower levels of the government and framed in the language of the central state, even as that language has fluctuated over time, is more likely an indication of politics as usual than a harbinger of some tectonic shift in state-society relations. To propose, as many observers do, that Chinese protesters are articulating a new understanding of state-society relations in which Western conceptions of citizenship and legal rights are infusing and thereby altering popular consciousness is to point toward the likelihood of bottom-up transformation. An escalation in the number of protests is equated with a rising civil society believed to be approaching some tipping point, after which political liberalization, democratization, or in some scenarios, revolution becomes unavoidable. To suggest, as I have tried to do here, that what we are seeing in China today reflects a much older rules consciousness in which savvy protesters frame their grievances against local cadres in officially approved terms in order to negotiate a better bargain with the authoritarian state, leads us to a far less dramatic, but perhaps more realistic expectation. Thank you.
Well, in keeping with Professor Perry's subtitle, Keeping with the Rules, I congratulate our speaker for keeping with the rules. That was very concise and very nice. Our next speaker is Robert Weller, who is a professor and chair of anthropology at Boston University and also a research professor at the Institute on Culture, Religion, and World Affairs. He's written extensively on religion and environmental movements. His most recent book is Ritual and Its Consequences, an essay on the limits of sincerity, published by Oxford this year. His co-author, who can't be with us today, is Yafi Sun, who is a graduate, actually a PhD candidate in sociology at my alma mater, actually, the University of Chicago. With pleasure, I turn the podium over to Professor Weller.
Thank you. I'm talking today mostly, this is the honesty and advertising moment of the talk, mostly about three of the many and diverse religious traditions that exist in China. Village-level, no-name temple religion, which for those of you who know the Chinese system of religious management is not a religion. It's not one of the 5 recognized religions, but it's by far the largest and most important religious tradition in China. I'll talk about that, about Buddhism, about Christianity, which means I'm leaving out Islam. I'm actually leaving out some of the Christians. I'm leaving out the Catholics. I'm leaving out everything every minority does in China, which is Christianity and of both kinds, and Islam, and all kinds of other things. I'm leaving all that out. I'm leaving out Neo-Confucians, which came up briefly earlier this morning. I'll take questions, but limitations of time, of space in the paper, which is already kind of long, and knowledge have led us to this direction for the paper. The paper itself, for those of you who want to look at it, is organized by those 3 big traditions, but I'm not going to do that today just to try to save some time. Instead, I want to talk about 2 broad issues, the way they relate to the religious traditions in China. First, the economy, that is, how does religion and economy, how do religion and economy interact with each other? And second, of course, the state and the system of political control over religion. The reason that's important, of course, is that since the reforms, religion has rebounded amazingly from almost 0 at the height of the Cultural Revolution, or at least almost 0 performed in the public sphere that we could actually see, to something you see everywhere, all the time, in many places. All right, first, the economic issues. If we look comparatively around the world, there are various kinds of ways religious traditions tend to react to economic change. Of course, this is an old Max Weber problem. In some cases, we see religions that seem really comfortable with the market economy, celebrate it. And of course, this ties to the Weber argument about Protestantism in Europe, but all kinds of other issues as well. In many cases, we don't see that, but we see a religion standing aside and saying, this market thing, it's about selfishness. It's about greed. It's the collapse of the communal morality on which our society has been built. And religion standing aside and making a moral critique, often not a radical critique. That is a ameliorist kind of critique, saying, look, you keep doing what you're doing, make money in the market, give it a tenth of it to us or however much to us, but come to us and be a better person. Don't fall into that trap. And then in a few cases, we get real rejections of the market, although I'm not going to talk about any cases like that today. So both of those, the celebration of the market and the moral alternative to the market, both occur quite frequently in China. And let me run through the 3 traditions briefly with that in mind. First, temple religion. Temple religion in China had a very low level of institutionalization, had no real sacred texts. There were booklets that you could pick up in temples and for the last several centuries that had moral messages in them, but you certainly could be a worshiper and never look at those books. There were no catechism classes. There were no formal priests who taught you the morality of the religion. It was basically a very utilitarian tradition, not where morality is irrelevant, but where it doesn't loom particularly large. And because it's not very institutionalized, it's quite flexible and adaptable as well. So what we've seen in every Chinese society as the market economy becomes important is this stuff, rather than fading away as quaint superstition, has just blossomed. Hong Kong, Taiwan, Chinese in Southeast Asia, and now China in the mainland itself, we see all of this growing very comfortably, and not just growing comfortably, but very much tied, as it was in the 19th century and earlier, very much tied to local, village level, or sometimes township level, social capital, and very local level political processes. In the paper, we look a little bit about the early revival of some of these things, which happens immediately with the reforms. 1978, 1979, we already see this going on, usually with women who are not the centerpieces of local social capital, usually, but it was politically safe for them to start doing this. In the case of larger, more important temples, men have almost always wrested the power away from women. So if you look at important temples, which are run by committees, as they always were, it's men, relatively wealthy and powerful men, ex-cadres, entrepreneurs, it's people like this, middle-aged, wealthy. It's the same sort of group we would see in Taiwan or Hong Kong, in fact. So we have this set of ties, growing comfortably, happy with the market economy, and as I'll talk about in a minute, relatively comfortable in many cases with local government as well. Buddhism. Buddhism, if you're a good old Weberian, Buddhism's the one that should flop with the market, right? This extra worldly religion, the only way to achieve nirvana was to withdraw from society. By all those Weber Protestant ethics standards, Buddhism wasn't supposed to work. I'm not talking about Taiwan today, but Taiwan is a lesson for us in how Buddhism can really reinvent itself and become a very thriving religion in the modern world. In China, the situation is complex. On the one hand, it certainly has been involved in the market and in a way that's not very helpful to it. That is, many people perceive Buddhism as venal and corrupt. The famous Shaolin Monastery, if you've only heard of one monastery, it's that one. There's been a lot of nasty press coverage about various kinds of corrupt-looking practices or at least venal practices from that temple. That's been one side of it, but there's another side where many monasteries are in fact trying to offer moral alternatives, and this is where Buddhism in China has been attempting to place itself. So they'll run summer camps for children, for high school students, something like that, to try to teach them morals. Retreats for adults for the same sort of purposes. Philanthropy, they're increasingly involved in various philanthropic kinds of projects. Christianity, let me spend a little bit more time on, because the situation of Christianity is rather complex. In the paper, we distinguish three broad trends of Protestantism in China right now. So let me talk about them really quickly, but separately. The first, there's a village-based, a rural Protestant boom, mostly in central China, Hunan, Anhui. It's really the Huai River Valley is the center of this kind of Christianity. It's rural. It's rather like folk religion in many ways. It's utilitarian. It's healing, laying on of hands, speaking in tongues, things that aren't all that strange if you're a villager from China, although they might be rather strange if you're a university intellectual from America or China. That's been comfortable enough with the market. The difference there from folk religion is that they're not tied to social capital in the same ways. That is, they tend to form a completely independent social community. Right, that's first. Second is what people have called the Wenzhou model. You all know the Wenzhou model as an economic model, but there is a Wenzhou model of Christianity as well, one where entrepreneurs really have taken the leading role, very wealthy entrepreneurs who have founded house churches and been quite important. This is a very different kind of Christianity. It's that prosperity cult kind of Christianity. It's the group that has managed to do both. We're comfortable with the market and we offer morals in an immoral world, both at once. But in this case, the argument is the morals are morals that will make you more successful as an entrepreneur. Christianity as the key to modernity in China is really the Wenzhou model as it's developed. Third, there's a kind of urban intellectual model. You see it a lot on college campuses and things like that. And while it's a relatively small number of people, it's potentially a quite influential group of people and so is important. For them, it's really the moral alternative model of Christianity that I think is crucial. All right, no more time for economic things. Politics. So, as most of you know, China attempts to control religion through 5 corporatist-style religious associations, one for each religion, and here Christianity is 2 religions, Protestantism and Catholicism. So that's the official zone for religion. Then there's a group of religions that are considered heterodox sects that are really illegal and repressed where they can find them. The most infamous one at the moment is probably Eastern Lightning, a Christianish offshoot that really is a little bit scary from everything I understand about it. The vast majority of the huge increase in the last 30 years, though, is not in either of these types. It's not the weird sectarian stuff, nor is it in the official religions, which are relatively stagnant, but it's in that big gray zone in between. Temple religion, all of it's gray, right? Because it is not religion. If we look at it through the lens of religion as Chinese cadres, it's feudal superstition. That's the term that's used for it, and it has no legal basis whatsoever. So there is no legal basis to have a local temple. Now, remember, these are things that can put on, a big one can put on an annual temple festival, and it'll have 100,000 people show up, 200,000 people, right? These are not little events. These are huge, huge realizations of the local social potential, so they're quite important. With no legal basis, they've found other ways to compromise with local power structures. The current one, I don't have time to go into any detail, the current fiction that lets everybody save face is not to see this through the lens of religion at all, but to see it through the lens of culture. That is, a temple is a way of maintaining ancient Chinese civilizational traditions. So there's one temple that some anthropologists in China have studied that on one side says temple to the great dragon king, and on the other side says museum of Chinese dragon culture, the dragon here read as the symbol of Chinese civilization. This is very common, and this seems to be the accepted alternative. It's displaced, for those of you who may follow this. A few years ago, there was talk of creating folk religion as a 6th religion. That seems to have faded in favor of this non-religious alternative. So there is some government discomfort at the scale on which these things operate, and we are talking about, there's no number, but hundreds of millions of people, probably, concentrated especially in certain areas, Southeast China above all, and Northwest China also to some extent. Still, we have a relatively peaceful relationship here. Buddhism. Buddhism, of all these traditions, has been relatively uncomfortable about wandering into that gray zone. They're the obedient ones, the good children. They mostly work through the Buddhist Association, the Chinese Buddhist Association, and this has limited their growth, quite frankly. So they're politically quite careful, but not lively. If you look at statistics, there are very few statistics, and most of them are garbage. You'll find few numbers in our paper, and I can explain that if you want. Buddhism seems to be increasing quite quickly. I think that's an artifact of popular religion people, temple religion people in polls having to answer one of the 5 official religions and saying that they're Buddhists. Christians. So really rapid growth in Christianity, almost all of it outside the official church. Almost all of it is in the Protestant house church movement. And in this case, unlike the temple religion, relations with government have almost uniformly been quite poor. Certainly in that Huai River area, they're almost universally bad. In the Wenzhou model, they're mixed. So there are some cases of these boss Christians who also have high party positions in Wenzhou, and it's known to the party that they're Christians, although you can't say it out loud. There's some house churches which are functioning publicly and have pretty good relations, and some Christians you can interview and they'll say there is no real difference between the house church and the Three Self movement. But there are other ones with just as nasty relations between the official church and the house church as you find in the inland areas. Still, in this house church movement, no good numbers, but let's say 50 million people, plus or minus 20%. That's just the house church movement, and then another, 20 million in more official churches. That's a lot of people, and it's fewer, many fewer than the temple religion people, but in a much more tense relationship with the government than the temple religion people. And the government recognizes this as a problem that has not responded well to repression, a problem that has not responded well to being ignored, if not well means really increasing quickly in a way that's a bit scary. So what are they going to do? I should point out an irony here. Several people, I was in China a few weeks ago, several people commented to me that if China becomes a Christian nation, it's going to be thanks to the Communist Party. And I think they're right. And the reason that's true is Christianity has been extremely comfortable functioning in that gray zone. They have no qualms whatsoever about expanding as fast as they can, evangelizing, which is illegal, in that gray zone, building these informal networks that allow you to do that. Buddhism has really been quite unwilling to do that kind of thing. Contrast this with Taiwan. Culturally almost an identical place, although politically with a rather different history. But remember, Taiwan coming out of a corporatist structure until 1987. That's not so different from what China currently has. So there was a single association for all Buddhists, one for all Taoists, and so forth. Christians were an exception there. And what happened there? Christianity utterly moribund, in spite of the huge missionary presence that moved over from the mainland. No growth whatsoever, probably shrinkage. And the Buddhists take over the island, essentially. It's the Buddhists who occupy the niche of the modern religion. Why does this not happen in mainland China? Why are we getting the reverse? It's partly because the Buddhists have really been tied down effectively by the Communist Party, and the Christians haven't been tied down at all effectively by the Communist Party, opening up the space for the Christians and closing it down for the Buddhists. Right, the future, I have 1 minute left to talk about the future, which we were asked to do. First, I'd point out since the Song dynasty, China has a very low level of institutionalization, the central institutionalization of any of its religious traditions by comparison with the historically Islamic or historically Christian world. And one implication of that is that attempts at central control even now have not been particularly effective. A second one is it's highly adaptable. There's not a big, heavy, say, monastic structure that's going to keep things from changing. This is a tradition that can change quite quickly as political and economic circumstances change. Second thing I wanted to say is the government, it has not escaped government notice that all of this growth is happening and that they don't know what to do about it. They don't even know how to monitor it very effectively. I think policy is under serious reconsideration right now, even as we speak. In fact, one of the most striking things was just 2 weeks ago, there was for the first time a meeting about an academic meeting, but still a public meeting on the house church at which registration of house churches not through the Three Self movement was openly discussed. This is radical stuff to be happening openly. So I think they're headed within a few years anyway towards some system, towards some revision of the registration relationship to try to ease the tension between house church and official church by making it possible to register independently from the official church. That sounds like a minor fix. And of course, if it really was a minor fix, they would have done it already. These people are smart. It's not a minor fix. It's a major change in the corporatist idea of how you run religious organizations and, in fact, how you run social organizations in general. And if you look at other kinds of NGOs, that gray area for them is also huge in China. If they were to open this up for Christians to do that, would they also open up Buddhism? I think it's a really crucial question. And if they were to do that, then I think, if what they're really worried about is Christian expansion, I keep saying, free up the Buddhists over there. That would be the way to create an alternative, as well as to get some kind of handle on what's going on with the Christians. Whether they'll do this or not in the near future, I don't know. I wouldn't be at all surprised to find it in the longer-term future. Let me end by citing Liz, kind of. I think this is a major change in the corporatist structure for religion that could be related to broader changes in the whole corporatist vision of the relationship between society and state. Does that bring us to civil society? Liz's argument is you can have all kinds of adaptations which are not democratic, which are not civil society, which live with an authoritarian government, but nevertheless provide the flexibility and adaptability to allow that system to keep going for the medium term, maybe the long term. And I completely agree with that. At the same time, I don't want to downplay the significance of such a change were it actually to take place. It really would be a re-envisioning of a broad image of how society is supposed to work. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rob. Our third speaker is Jamie Horsley, who is the Deputy Director of the China Law Center and a Senior Research Scholar and Lecturer in Law at the Yale Law School. Before moving to Yale, Ms. Horsley was a partner in a major law firm which established its office in Beijing in 1981. And she was there, I think, as the partner in charge. You were the office from 1981 to 1983, and then subsequently managed the China practice from Hong Kong, 1986 to 1990. She's also served as a commercial attaché in the U.S. embassies in Beijing and in Manila from 1991 to 1995. She'll speak on progress and paradox, the limits of legal reform in China.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks, Joe, for inviting me to be here today. I think this morning a lot of the speakers have teed up a lot of issues that relate to rule of law and legal reform, and so I'll start out with a few comments on that first. It's interesting to think back about how I got involved in what I am currently doing, and a lot of it traces back to my work with Professor Liu and the Carter Center on village elections. I first heard about village elections in China when I was working for Motorola in China and doing a lot of thinking and a policy job about how does China establish rule of law? How do you move a country that has no tradition of rule of law or democracy towards a country that has rule of law? And one of the things that struck me is that to have rule of law, you have to have the people buy into the system. They have to take ownership of it. They have to internalize the norms, the culture of law. And how do you do that? Well, the main way we do it in the West is we have the people get involved in writing the laws and revising the laws and litigating under the laws. And village elections at that time, I first heard in the late 90s, was really the only game in town in terms of trying to get Chinese people involved somehow in making choices and getting involved in government and learning what it means to vote, to make an individual decision. And I found that that was very exciting. Subsequently, as I started working with them and started reading the various laws, I don't know if you remember this, Yahweh, but I emailed you one day. I got very excited because I was reading about how part of the governing side, once you're elected and you become a villager committee member, there were also rules in this law about how village committees were supposed to govern. And one of the principles that was espoused was something called openness in village affairs, 顺务公开, transparency. And again, I begin to think, wow, this is very powerful. You know, they realize at the grassroots that the people want to know what's going on. They want to know primarily how the funds and the fees they're being charged are being used. And so they were supposed to be putting on blackboards reports of finances. Every 6 months, they were supposed to make a financial report. This is very, very basic stuff and very powerful. And sure enough, as I moved on to other work and became involved in the China Law Center, one of the very first projects I was asked to work on by the Shanghai government was working with them as they drafted They're open government information provisions. And I could go back and trace how from Sunwu Gungkai in the villages, this concept of transparency had broadened up to township level and all the way county, and eventually to the center as something called Zhengwu Gungkai. And there was also, which is transparency in government affairs. And there were transparency in all kinds of affairs. And then suddenly it began to be legalized, so that what open government information regulations are all about are open government information, not open government affairs per se. I saw the beginning of this transparency movement as well as the beginning of a participatory governance model. Again, if you look in the PRC thing, back at the village elections and the participation there, you can trace through at least party leaders' comments and government language how a lot of it developed from the same concepts that came out of the village election experience. In a way, you could see village elections as a training ground, not only for democracy, but also for the foundations of rule of law. I was also struck Professor Perry's comments about protest, and I think what my paper talks about, what my work has been all about, is that the Chinese government is trying to replace the paradigm of having protests be seen as the most effective way to engage government to enforce its own rules, to one where government is participating, the people are participating with government to write the rules. And if they're writing the rules, they're more likely to comply with the rules. And this is what's happening now. And what I find very exciting, and what I find to be a real break with traditions in China, these twin policies of transparency, which has become institutionalized now, and this other one of getting the public involved in writing rules and making decisions, not only at the center, but all the way down to local areas. This is all something that we call administrative law. And when I was in law school, I didn't even take administrative law because it sounded very boring. It's all about the rules by which government regulates its own behavior and action. But in fact, if you talk to a lot of Chinese legal scholars, administrative law reform is the most exciting area of law in China over the last 2 decades. Because what it is all about is actually government reform. It's politics. It's political reform. But talking about these concepts in the rubric of law allows you to talk about things that really have much broader political implications. And I will also say first that a lot of people think I'm way too optimistic. I'm not. I know that this has a long way to go. But I have to say that now, in 2008, December 2008, I'm already seeing movements toward institutionalizing these things. And I do think that it reflects a great change on the part of the attitude of government toward people. And as Yahweh Liu mentioned, if you want to move toward more democracy, the government has to trust the people. And this idea of interacting and working and experimenting on participatory mechanisms is one way to start building exactly this trust that you need before the sort of democratization experiment can really move forward. So backing up to December 78, I was very struck. Deng Xiaoping had the same idea, law and politics inextricably intertwined. He said in the communique on law, he said it's very important coming out of the chaos of the Cultural Revolution that we build democracy. In order to build democracy, we need law. We need to introduce the socialist legal system that will systematize and maintain the power of democracy and law itself. And his famous, he had a 4-term phrase, there must be laws to follow. These laws must be observed. They must be strictly enforced. And lawbreakers must be dealt with. And you see these terms still showing up even today, being quoted in a lot of documents. What my paper does is talk about how December 78, as with the economy and the politics, China was in shambles. They basically had no courts, they had no Ministry of Justice, they had no law schools, they had very few lawyers, most of whom were trained 20 or 30 years before. There was really nothing to start with. They were starting out of whole cloth. And they moved very rapidly, as they did on economic reform, to start building a legal system. Fast forward 30 years, the progress is they have a lot of law in the books now. They have a fairly complete legal system. It looks pretty good, promises a lot of rights. And actually, although in the press we normally hear about a lot of the problems in China with their law system, in fact, there are millions of cases being brought every day, a lot of transactions going through. So the law system in the ordinary course is really beginning to play its function. We've got a burgeoning bar, still not enough lawyers for such a big country, but they are not only going into commercial law firms to make a lot of money and work on real estate transactions. Now we're seeing this new breed of lawyers taking on public interest cases. We see law professors moving away from their research-oriented approach to becoming activists, establishing legal aid clinics, trying to write the laws too. So we've seen a big development, a lot of progress in terms of sort of reestablishing the institutions of law and putting a lot of laws on the books. But the Chinese government recognizes as well that when it comes to the other three goals of enforcing, getting compliance with those laws, not only by the people, but by the government itself, getting the government to abide by its own rules is still a problem, as well as enforcing it and getting accountability for when you break the law. And this is what I want to go into. I mean, instead of a lot of people talk about criminal law developments and constitutional law and commercial law, et cetera, but in the few minutes that I have, I wanted to focus on what was happening in this administrative law reform, which really only started taking off in the 90s. Professor Perry uses in her article and her presentation this term rule by law. And of course, Deng Xiaoping was trying to move China from rule by man, traditionally the emperor, more recently Mao, toward something called rule of law. And the initial phase, they were very more successful in establishing what people call rule by law, where the state was using law to regulate society and the market and interactions between society, et cetera. Moving toward rule of law means having the law govern state power itself too. And this is very interesting because the state itself, just like the party is starting to write its own internal rules and enforce them among themselves, the state, through administrative law, is also regulating itself and making itself accountable. The first thing that happened that really caused shockwaves was adoption of something called administrative litigation law in 1989, the year of Tiananmen. They passed this law which allowed citizens for the first time to sue the government if the government was misbehaving. And the law was rather limited. It has a lot of flaws, but people have been using it. And despite sort of limited success, they continue to use it. And occasionally they win against the government. But what often happens that we're discovering now is people start bringing these suits, and a lot of them end up being settled out of court. As a matter of saving face for the government, they don't want to have to go in court and admit that a lot of the times they are wrong. Instead, they agree to change their behavior, they settle it, and they go off. And so, in fact, administrative litigation is probably more successful than people realize. But again, this was an amazing new thing where people said the Chinese government is willing to allow people to sue them. It's a very, very new thing. And they started putting in place a whole series of other laws. They've established an administrative appeal system called administrative reconsideration within agencies to appeal it. Hasn't worked very well because people think, why do you go to the agency that created the problem in the first place? You're not very likely to get a good result. But they're working on improving that. They put in place a group of laws which basically allowed citizens to seek redress after the fact, after the government's already done something wrong, and then you go in and you get compensation or a change of behavior. Another group of laws, which was more recent and very exciting, were ones where the law seeks to regulate government behavior before the fact. And the first of these, which again a lot of legal scholars said was a revolution, was something called administrative penalties law. And this provided that before government could, for example, issue a fine to a vendor selling fruit on the street, that vendor has to get notice of his penalty. He has to be given an opportunity to go in and defend himself and explain what happened. And the whole thing has to be transparent, and there's a right to a free hearing. This is something where in the West we call due process, which again is unheard of in Chinese tradition. The idea that the state must follow notions of fairness and due process in the way that they behave, in the way that they regulate, in the way that they deal with people. The more recent one along this line was something called the administrative licensing law, or sometimes it's called the permit law or the approval law. This law has no counterpart anywhere in the world. And what it was intended to do, again, was to regulate an aspect of behavior that had gotten totally out of control. Just like California, I recall, a few years ago. It got to the point where if this poor fruit vendor wanted a license to set up his stall, he needed 100 shops. He had to go around to all these different people, and of course, this opened huge opportunities for corruption and rent seeking. So what this law tried to do was to limit and cut back on the number of agencies that could impose a licensing requirement. And it also cut back on the situations in which you could do it. And it actually introduced Western concepts of market failure. Government cannot impose a license if this is something that the market can take care of, or associations and individuals can self-regulate. Only in the event of failure or inability of these to function is the government supposed to establish a license. This came out in 2004 and again was seen as incredibly revolutionary. Very hard to implement in China. And in fact, the government for the first time ever called governors all together to Beijing to talk to them about this law, how they really had to start getting control of the licensing. And we have a visitor at Yale now doing a similar project, which is to look at how do you regulate fees, user fees that the government imposes? Because the same thing's happening in China. Everybody is collecting fees for various things. And the question is, when should you do it, who should you do it, and what do you do with the money that's collected? So this idea of government, the state, self-consciously choosing to regulate itself, to allow itself to be sued, was a very interesting development. Of course, it's not self-enforcing, and the trick, just as with the Pardee rules, is what do you do if people don't abide by the rules and they want to use the formal institution and what they're doing is harming you? What rule of law is all about is you can go beyond these and seek, in the US and a lot of Western countries, it's the courts that will step in and seek to enforce these rules against the state. And that's the paradox, that's the problem, that even as the Communist Party espouses rule of law and claims that it believes in it, it really doesn't. It still has constrained the ability of the courts and judges to enforce these. So I've run out of time before I got to the main thing I wanted to talk about, but it was the development from experimentations of open government information. First allowed as an experiment in localities. Guangzhou was the first. In fact, colleagues of Professor Ren and Mei Li there at Zhongshan Daxue came out and helped draft the very first provisions in Guangzhou that provide a government has to make the information in its files available to the public, either on its own initiative or upon request. This now went all the way up and through a lot of experiment, and China came out with some national regulations last year that went into effect May 1st. Why did they choose to do this? You know, I don't have the answer. I mean, I know some things. The question there was about corruption. One of the drivers of open government, allegedly, or one of them really is the idea that if you're more open, there's a less chance to have corruption. And one of the big supporters that pushed through adoption of this rule, which constrains government behavior, was the party's Central Discipline Commission. And they really felt if you make government more open, it'll help give them a better handle, you know, on corruption, as well as for the center to figure out what it is that the localities are really doing. This is all sort of idealized, even in the US. Our freedom of information laws don't quite accomplish this, but that's the hope and the idea. And sure enough, since the regulations went into effect, almost immediately, they talk about in the first 7 days, 7 big cases hit the media about farmers, retired workers, asking for information about things going on, as well as law professors and lawyers. Then the other thing that's been developing, so that's been institutionalized now. It's going to be very difficult to implement the law itself. It's not as strong as it could have been, but they did it. They committed themselves to open up their files. This is a different openness than the Gaigo Kaifang. This isn't opening to the outside world. This is the government opening itself up to the public. And the second one is this idea of public participation in rulemaking and in decision-making, which would be things like urban land use planning and environmental impact assessments and all that kind of thing. And again, if you read the paper, read the one after it's revised. This also has been developing very slowly. And just this year now, this spring, both the State Council, in terms of its own executive regulations, it has promised and has started doing, actually, virtually every single draft regulation is now made public for comment. This is, in the US, we call notice and comment procedure. They're still using public hearings, which started earlier, but have a lot of issues with them. What we rely on a lot in the US is this idea of the written hearing. You know, you make the draft available, comments come in, you read them, you do your draft and explain how you use the comments. And the National People's Congress, as you may have noticed, they've started making all their laws, and they have committed virtually all draft laws now will be made public for public comment. And they've, in fact, started doing this more and more recently. So you have these two twin institutions, open information and transparency, and this new idea of public participation where the comments come in, and the idea is the government has to make a response to explain it heard the comments and why it rejected some and why did it accept others and come up with its final rule. These are all controllable by the party because they control the information, they control the process and the final decision. But I think it's moving China along this continuum toward a rule of law. The question is, for the next 30 years, will they ever really allow themselves to achieve it? But I don't have time, so I'm not going to try to answer that. Thank you very much.
I'm sorry to play the role of the mean Zaim, which means political boss in Arabic. But I do want to say I very much enjoyed reading these three papers. They're pieces of mature scholarship. They're lucid. They're fascinating. And under the rubric of social order, they hold together very well. I could offer extended comments. We don't have time for that. I want to make one brief comment on each paper. And rather than asking the speakers to respond to my comments immediately, what I'm going to do is open the floor for 3 concise questions, because we have to finish in just a few moments. So 3 concise questions from, let's say, different sides of the room. With respect to Professor Perry's paper, Playing by the Rules, Popular Protest in China, she, in her presentation in the paper, emphasizes that what she is not seeing is the sort of emergence of a Chinese civil society. It'd be helpful if she specified what she means by civil society. I suspect what she means is a sort of Tocquevillian perspective, maybe associated with the work of her colleague Robert Putnam, but she might also mean a Hegelian perspective, which is to say a sociability between the realm of the family and the state, which may or may not be supportive of the state, or perhaps a Gramscian notion of civil society, where civil society is an extension of the hegemony of the regime. So it'd be nice to spell that out. In the 1990s, almost 20 years ago, in fact, early 1990s, I headed a major project on civil society in the Middle East. We probably began the project with a little bit more optimism than we finished with, but one of the enduring values of that project, which is available in multiple volumes and so on, was that the authors focused on some key areas for analysis, which included how the state basically manipulates and controls civil society, how the state co-ops associations, informal and formal, how it creates basically government imitations of private associations. So perhaps it would be useful to explore that a bit. Maybe that's a topic for another conference or another panel, but it seems to me that that sort of flowed out of Professor Perry's comments. But I would certainly like to hear the specification of what civil society is in her mind. With respect to the co-authored paper by Sun Yan Fi and Rob Weller, frankly, and this may surprise Rob, I mean, I heard a lot of comments that resonated with my work in the Middle East, with Christians playing the role of Muslims. I mean, when I look at the Middle East, what I see is an extraordinary diversity of Islamic associability. I see a phenomenon of lots of sort of autodidacts, lay people and so on, creating their own religious movements, institutions, and so on. This seems to very much be going on in China. Of course, you have another phenomenon of the Muslim minority in China, which is a different topic, which is not discussed in the paper at all. But I did hear an awful lot of similarity. Now, it seems to me that what you have in China is a state which would like to maintain sort of lay control after the French model of religion, and is failing. And instead, perhaps we see a sort of incipient process of secularization. And perhaps that's something that you may wish to comment on. With respect to Jamie Horsley's paper, we obviously have an issue here of unintended consequences, which is very obvious. What I found so striking about the paper, and which probably depressed me a little bit, was the extent to which, in the state's efforts to rationalize business practice and political practice and so on, it was actually establishing at least incipient accountability, whereas the governments that I study in the Middle East are pointedly focused on preventing accountability and depoliticizing public space, whereas what you're reporting is the first steps in the politicization of public space, which is quite striking. So in any case, 3 really fine papers. I was really privileged to be able to read them. And now let me take a question from each of the three sides here. Yes.
Hi, my name is Rowena from the Fairbairn Center. I have a question for two questions for Professor Perry. After 18
one question, please.
Okay, one question then. So after 89 in the post-Tiananmen era, we can see that.
Can you speak
hear
up
me?
just a little
Okay,
bit?
sure.
It's hard to hear you.
So in the post-Tiananmen era, even though protest or resistance at different levels, they play by rule, as you mentioned, still there were lots of suppressions and punishments towards these people. For example, in the rural level, Taishi village, that's the example, right? And also the recent case for Li Datong, from establishment intellectuals become disestablished because of the kind of resistance they had. And the most recent case is Lanfang Do Shibao, and the recent one just last week happened. The deputy director was removed from her position with speculation of her support of Changping's views earlier. So for this kind of, what would be the implications for this kind of suppressions and punishments, even though people try to play by rule, but they were still punished in this kind of protest?
Thank you. From this side of the room? Yes, sir.
I have a question for Professor Weller. It's the question of using the category of culture in order to legitimize popular religion in particular. Who is behind this? Could you tell us a little bit more? I visited Shanghai, and actually some academics have been called by the government to talk about these issues, and they have used culture in order to legitimize the religious sphere, for example, to use it for the Expo of 2010 in Shanghai, and have religious associations rallied for representing Chinese society to the world. Is this a ruse of intellectuals in order to allow liberty for religion, or is it really that these intellectuals are paused in the hands of the government, who are just implementing the religious policy of the government?
Thank you. A final question? Yes, ma'am. Yes, Binyai.
A question for Professor Weller too, about your distinction between temple religion and the Buddhism. I don't see the distinction in practice, because if you ask any people who practice temple religion, they claim themselves as Buddhists. In fact, what will be Buddhism in your definition, really?
So I suggest we ask each of the speakers to take 3 minutes, and we have permission to go until 50 minutes after the hour. So if you start, perhaps Professor Perry will run right across the panel. Thank you.
Thank you for the questions. First of all, obviously, civil society can have and has had many different meanings among Western theorists as well. What I had in mind here is the work of Timothy Garton Ash and others who applied this term to Eastern Europe preceding the collapse of communism there in 1989. And usually in those writings by analysts of Eastern Europe, what is emphasized is the autonomy of associations from the state, that you had environmental groups like Blue Danube in Hungary, or you had the theater in Czechoslovakia, or you had Solidarity in Poland, that were developing an oppositional culture against the state and a space in which people developed a sense of society having its own rules that were superior morally to those of the state. And that's what I don't see expressed in popular protest in China today. It may be developing in other areas of China. All I'm talking about in this paper is popular protest and the tendency of journalists and scholars, in my view, to way overinterpret protest in directions that they find amenable. And I really think that protest in China on the whole has been remarkably non-autonomous, that people have been engaged with the state, with its discourse, its rules and regulations at every level. A very interesting question about how protesters respond to state repression. And I think, all things being equal, of course, state repression can radicalize movements, but it depends how the state represses that movement and how that repression is understood by ordinary people. If state repression also seems to play by the rules, then I think it can have the effect that the state hopes for, namely to reduce violent protest. And I think one can explain, for example, the state's very strong suppression of Falun Gong in the 1990s, and also the China Democracy Party, because in the state's view, those organizations were not playing by the rules, even though they were nonviolent, but they were organizing people across territorial boundaries, across class boundaries, educational boundaries, party members, non-party members, members of the military, non-members of the military. All of them were being contacted by cell phones and over the internet and so on, and that the government viewed as a violation of the rules of people to stay in their place and to protest about issues and grievances that were particular to their geographic or occupational niche. And in those cases, I believe that, in fact, the state's repression of those movements of Falun Gong and of the China Democracy Party had the intended effect. People could understand why the state was behaving as repressively as it did, and in fact, similar kinds of movements seem to not have gotten much traction. In other cases where, and it's often local state leaders make the decision to call in the Public Security Bureau and to brutally repress local protests, it seems to me it probably has a very different effect, that it builds radicalism and anti-state feeling at the local level, that this has to be a two-way street unless protest is going to turn into something that in fact, potentially can be much more oppositional to the state.
Let me take the questions in reverse order, starting with Yemin's. It's a good question. How do you define the difference between temple religion and Buddhism? And I would properly add Taoism to that too, since if you're doing the poll and you say which of the 5 religions are you, you'll get either Buddhist or Taoist from people. From the popular religion point of view, there's a sort of vague continuum between me, a guy who burns incense to my ancestors, and a Buddhist monk someplace. From a Buddhist point of view, it's not really the same. So a Buddhist would draw a line. The basic problem is there's no equivalent of baptism. There's no line you can draw and say somebody's in, somebody's out. From a Buddhist point of view, it would be taking the 3 refuges, the most basic of the vows that you can make, which indicate to the Buddhist establishment a kind of serious commitment to the specific project of Buddhism rather than to the vague project of Chinese religiosity. So that's here in this paper, that's the kind of distinction that we're making. But you're certainly right that some local villager is very likely to say, I'm a Buddhist, and in some dialects of Chinese, the God image is called a Buddha, even if it's, the thunder god or the emperor of heaven or some clearly non-Buddhist deity. So it's not clear, and this is one of the reasons I didn't want to give numbers, or you can't give numbers for these kinds of things. Eugenio's question, that's a good question. Who is behind this culture idea? I don't know. So just a really brief speculation. I don't think it's a government-initiated agenda. I think it began with some rather clever local temples justifying their position by bringing in intellectuals, and intellectuals for whom it really aided their own agendas. So it's folklore department people in particular who've been very active because this is their view of what goes on, and this lets them study this stuff and be legitimate, right? They're not studying feudal superstition and how great it is. They're studying Chinese culture and how great it is. It serves their interests, but it's worked. It's a way. It turned out to be a way of creating a kind of peace locally, of moving temples outside the view of the Religious Affairs Bureau, the county-level Religious Affairs Bureau, and more toward the Minzhangbu, the Civil Affairs, or something like that. I think it's something like that, but it'd be really nice if somebody actually looked to see what's going on, because I don't know for sure. Richard's 2 questions. The Christians are the Muslims of China. I mean, that's an interesting thought. I think there is something to that. There's also an enormous difference, I think, in being a small minority as opposed to a big majority. We're still talking, the biggest numbers you get for Christians in China now would be 7 or 8%. My guess is it's more like 5 or 6. We don't really know. But it's a small minority everywhere. Even Wenzhou, which everyone says is the big place, the most concentration, it's 12%, maybe, something like that.
Which is to say about 160% of the size of Egypt.
Well, it's the absolute number is huge, but if it's people scattered around the country, it's not significant in the same way. The French model thing, you're exactly right. It's a French model, and it's not a communist. It's not the communists. It's the KMT in 1911 that pick up a French model of what the relationship between church and state is supposed to be, and there's really no change in that view when the communists come, especially if we ignore the Cultural Revolution part. I don't see that changing, actually. I think the elite is really committed to that view of the relationship between state and society. Whatever they do, I don't think that fundamental view will change. If it were to change, it would be because these neo-post-Confucians, whatever they are, won and managed to get themselves taken in. But as Professor Ren talked about this morning, that's a tough one, actually, to happen. Is it secularization? At lunch, you'll have to tell me what you meant by secularization. I don't think it's secularization in the sense of de-religionization. We've only seen an increase, and looking at other Chinese societies, I wouldn't expect that to change. Nor is it secularization in the sense of an increasing separation of the religious sphere from other spheres of life. If anything, I'd say we've seen a decrease in what had been, over the last century, an increased separation. So my first thought is no, at least until you tell me exactly what you meant. Thank you.
Well, I didn't have a comment from the audience, but I'll respond to yours. And I wanted to say something about the development of civil society or non-government organizations in China also. I mean, no one's really talked this morning about the harmonious society, which is, of course, a new policy goal of the current administration as well. But what we see happening as they start developing these mechanisms to have more public input into the policymaking process, the government's having trouble getting the public mobilized. If you're a Beijing municipality and you issue a draft rule about how you manage your pet dog, you will get thousands of comments and ideas, or firework regulation. But if you're, the state council and you're issuing a draft regulation on, antitrust law, you're not going to get a lot of input. And it's not lost on them that in Western countries, one way that you make this work is you have associations collecting input and funneling them into government. And it's been very interesting to watch over the last few years, government saying, how do we get associations and civil society to start performing this function? Because we know government is happy to have NGOs help them implement their law and policy, and they want NGOs to help self-regulate what they're doing. But the idea of NGOs, civil society, organizing for advocacy purposes is something that they found quite scary. And so what, in fact, these new mechanisms provide is, to put in Chinese terms, a channel for orderly participation by citizens in the policymaking process, which is a very nice step, again, in getting government more comfortable with the idea of civil society being more proactive and dynamic.
Thank you very much. Before we thank the speakers, I want to note that the conference organizers have left a special gift here, which I'm sure is a timeless memento that may even become a family heirloom over the ages. And thanks to each of the speakers. Please join me in thanking them for their really fine participation today.